So let me ask you a question. Is it good to abstain from sex? In other words, to be celibate? Now, if we were in church, this wouldn't be a question that I would ask you to discuss with your neighbour, the person next to you. Most of us are pretty reserved and hesitant to talk about sex. And before we get started on this subject, it's worth saying that talking about sex, particularly in a church context, is quite difficult. It's a deeply personal subject, and we're all coming at it from different experiences. But I hope that we'll see that the passage that we're looking at today is relevant for all of us, married or single, whatever our experience. But what of the contemporary context? Well, I found a recent Guardian article exploring the subject of celibacy. And he said this: in a world where you can get a sexual partner faster than a pizza delivery, it has never been easier to play the field. Yet despite all that swiping right, a surprising number of people are not having sex at all. Not for religious reasons or because they can't get a date, but because they find that celibacy makes them happier. The article went on to say that we live in a society where sex is free and easy, online dating apps, online pornography, little societal disapproval, but it may be surprising that various surveys tell us that people today are having sex less than people maybe a generation ago, for all kinds of reasons. Too busy, too tired, dating too risky and difficult. Sex and relationships are risky, both with your health and with your well-being. So it seems that for many, although sex has never been freer, easier and more available, sex is complicated, difficult, and can cause all kinds of problems. So what does God have to say to us about sex through the passage that we're looking at today? Well, I'll read the passage and then we'll explore what it has to say. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verses 1 to 9. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Well, first the question: is sexual abstinence good? Yes or no? That's what verse 1 is saying. In verse 1, Paul turns to matters that the Corinthian church had written to him about. They've got questions about sex, marriage, and singleness. And it seems at least some of them are saying that it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, if you've been here for the last 2 sessions on this subject, this might be a bit surprising given the degree of sexual immorality that was going on in the city, and also, to their shame, in the Corinthian church. But there seem to be at least some, perhaps in reaction to all this sexual immorality, who are saying that it's just better not to have sex at all, to just abstain. You're better off if sex is not part of your life. Maybe the Christians were anticipating the new age to come, because Jesus himself said in Matthew 22:30, at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They'll be like the angels in heaven. Or maybe they were using Jesus or Paul as examples, since they were both unmarried and indeed celibate. Well, whatever the reason, there seemed to be a tendency to asceticism in the church. People thinking that voluntary abstinence from something gets them closer to God, that it is for their spiritual good. Muslims certainly think this. During Ramadan, they will give up food and drink and sex during the daylight hours. And if they slip up, then the remedy is apparently to feed 60 poor people. And Christians too think that giving something up sometimes is a good thing. It might be giving up meat on Fridays, or something else during Lent, or maybe fasting from time to time. Now, Paul's answer to this question about abstinence from sex is not straightforward. His answer is yes, and his answer is no. In a nutshell, he says this: no, you're wrong. Sex is in fact good, but it has to be in the marriage relationship, not outside it. And yes, you're right. Being celibate is good if you are single, not married. Indeed, being married isn't for everyone. So let's look at Paul's first answer to the question, is sexual abstinence good? And his first answer is no. In fact, sex within marriage is good. Look at verse 2. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The problem in Corinth with sexual immorality, as we've seen already in chapters 5 and 6, and in chapter 6, Paul urges the Corinthian Christians to flee sexual immorality. That's sex outside marriage. But he's not saying that means no sex at all. Within the marriage relationship, the husband and the wife should continue to have sex with each other, and within marriage, sex should be valued as good. And notice Paul's emphasis on mutuality. We're going to see this repeatedly in this chapter. What goes for the husband goes equally for the wife. And for Christians, there should be equality and mutuality in the marriage relationship. Also, this is an exclusive relationship. Relations are to only be with your own wife and with your own husband. These two belong to each other in an exclusive relationship, holding on to and keeping to one another. And for Christians, marriage is a monogamous, faithful union. So contrary to what these ascetics were saying, sex is in fact good, provided it is within the married relationship between husband and wife. And so in verses 3 to 4, Paul makes three overlapping points. First, in verse 3, there is mutual and equal obligation to give to one another. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. So whatever the reason, there seemed to be so in a Christian marriage, the husband is to give what is due to his wife. In the context, the emphasis is on sexual intimacy, but the phrase should not be limited to that. He's under obligation in partnership to offer support and companionship, as well as intimacy. And notice again that this applies to both husband and wife equally. In a Christian marriage, the wife is to give what is due to her husband, and vice versa. So this is not about taking, it's about giving. It's not about conjugal rights, but conjugal obligations. The two are in debt to each other sexually and should not seek to avoid their debts. Now, this kind of language might make some hackles rise. Obligation, particularly in the context of sexual activity, might strike some as a kind of demeaning way to talk of such a relationship. It also raises the question of consent, which is a live contemporary issue. But there is no question of sex being forced on the partner. There is a mutual and equal obligation on both to give to one another voluntarily. Secondly, in verse 4, both have mutual and equal authority over each other's body. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. And again, it's striking how Paul is going out of his way to emphasize the reciprocity in this relationship. In this verse, the wording is identical for the wife and the husband. And to balance things out, the wife comes first in this verse rather than the husband, as he has in the previous sentences. It's almost as if Paul has been on an equality course before they were even invented. No one was saying this sort of thing in the first century. Paul is way ahead of his time. And sometimes Paul gets a bit of a bad press when it comes to what people believe his attitude towards women is. But when you read this chapter in particular, it corrects that kind of view. And here Paul is giving a reason for the obligations that a husband and wife owe each other. In a Christian marriage, the couple give themselves to the other, so their bodies come under the authority of the other. They're no longer two separate entities, but they become one flesh, which is what is discussed in the previous chapter. And as such, the body of each belongs to the other. Everything is given to the other in marriage, not least each other's body. Now, I'm not sure that this comes across as very romantic, but the Song of Songs, a Hebrew love poem in the Old Testament, puts this mutuality more passionately. In chapter 2 and verse 16, the lover says of her beloved, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." And in chapter 6, verse 3, "I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine." And in Christian marriage, husband and wife are concerned not with what they can get, but with what they can give to one another, the outcome of deep love for one another. And then thirdly, in verses 5 to 6, both should not deprive each other on spiritual grounds. So don't deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so you may devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. Now, the word deprive is actually a forceful one, which often means defraud. Paul is reinforcing the idea he's already made that it's wrong to take away what rightfully belongs to each other in marriage. Don't deprive one another of what rightfully belongs to your beloved. And some Corinthians were suggesting that one reason for abstinence is to devote yourself to more spiritual matters. Something, in fact, that Christians down the ages have advocated from time to time. Give you an example. Yves of Chartres, who's an influencer in the Middle Ages, he said this: he counseled the devout to abstain from sexual intercourse on Thursdays in remembrance of Christ's rapture, on Fridays in remembrance of Christ's crucifixion, on Saturdays in honor of the Virgin Mary, on Sundays in commemoration of Christ's resurrection, and on Mondays out of respect for departed souls. He didn't go on to Tuesday and Wednesday, so left at least those 2 days for the devout to look forward to. And Paul accepts that abstinence is possible, provided both agree and that it is for a limited period of time. But this is a concession on his part. It's by no means a command. Why? Because there are dangers in this mutual abstinence. One or both may be tempted by Satan because of their lack of control. And if you kind of need proof of this, you should look at the experience of Jerome, a 4th century monk who lived for a while as a desert hermit, tried to cut himself off from all temptation. And he wrote later about how that worked out for him. Though in my fear of hell, I had consigned myself to this prison where my only companions were scorpions and wild beasts, I often found myself amid bevies of girls. My face was pale and my frame chilled with fasting, yet my mind was inflamed with desire, and the fires of lust kept bubbling up before me. Jerome learnt the hard way that the more we try to think of something or try not to think of something, the more we think about it. And it's no use denying that the normal God-given sexual drive is a strong force. To deny this or to pretend that one or the other of you has complete control over this, particularly when living in a close, intimate, married relationship, it is to deny reality. So contrary to the Corinthian slogan suggesting that sexual activity was unspiritual, Paul is saying for married couples, giving up sexual activity would in fact be the unspiritual thing to do. And some people down the centuries have suggested that the Bible is in some way against sex and that sex is in some way sinful. But the opposite is true. The Bible says that sex is for marriage, and sex is crucially important as a component of that marriage. Needless abstinence leads not to self-control, but to temptation by Satan. And this is very practical wisdom. Well, we're not finished with this passage. In answer to this question, is sexual abstinence good, yes or no? In verses 7 to 10, Paul goes on to say, well, yes, sexual abstinence is good. But as we've just seen, not if you're married. Look at verse 7. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you have your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. When Paul says he wishes that all were as he is, he's almost certainly talking about the single celibate, unmarried state. And we'll see later in this series that Paul thinks there are major advantages as a Christian of not being married. It's not that he's against marriage, but marriage is not for everyone. Being celibate is a good thing. Sex is not everything. Though for those who are married, sex is very important and should be valued. And he sums this up by saying that whatever your marital state, it is a gift from God. So use it in God's service. If you're single and therefore celibate, this gives you freedoms for service to God that those who are married don't necessarily always have. If you're married, then this gives you responsibilities and obligations towards one another, whilst also living out the gospel. And both states offer rewards and frustrations, but God gives grace. That's what that word gift in this verse means, whether we're single or whether we're married. So the question arises, should the unmarried marry? Verse 8, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do. The unmarried and widows should not feel under pressure to get married. Not being married is good, as is being married. But, verse 9, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. And now there are two ways of looking at this verse. Firstly, a couple who love each other and whose passions burn within them should not put off marriage, but they should get married and consummate their love for one another. That's how the NIV sees it, and it adds the words with passion in its translation. They're not there in the original. And because they're not in the original Greek, another way of looking at this verse is to see it directed at those who cannot control their sexual desires for another person and are having sex outside marriage. Paul is saying, well, they should get married so they're not consumed or punished for their sins. In other words, if you're sinning by having sex outside marriage, then get married. Either way, the message is simple. A couple who are in love, whether they're engaging in sex or not, should get married. Well, we've come a long way in exploring these verses. So let me sum up what they're saying. To the Corinthians slogan, it's good for a person not to have sexual relations, Paul says this. On the one hand, the Corinthians are wrong. Abstinence within marriage is not good at all. And on the other hand, they're right. Abstinence, if you're single, is good. And certainly marriage is not for everyone. So this passage is speaking to all of us, married or single. For those who are married, this is a gift from God and sex matters. Each of you in a marriage relationship has an obligation to your beloved to give yourself to them. Abstinence, even for spiritual reasons, should not be the norm. Of course, that doesn't mean that the spiritual life is not important. It is and should not be neglected as you serve God together by his grace. For those who are single, this is a gift from God, and sexual abstinence does matter. And by God's grace, use your unmarried state in service for God. And for those who are unmarried but in a sexual relationship, then as a Christian, it is better that you either abstain or you marry than go on sinning. Now, I'm conscious that in the service today, we're going to be taking communion together in a few minutes. And this is not an easy passage to segue into communion with. So I just want to finish by focusing our minds on the wedding supper of the Lamb. And whether you're married or not, the bigger relationship that all of us as Christians have is with Christ. It's as if as the church, we're all engaged to him. We are his bride. He is our beloved. He knows us and he loves us. And he's demonstrated his love for us by dying for us, giving up his life in sacrifice to bring us to him without stain, without wrinkle, without blemish, as Paul describes it in Ephesians 5. And one day he will return and there will be a glorious wedding supper, the wedding supper of the Lamb. And this is the permanent experience that the impermanent, temporary marriage experience that some of us have now is pointing towards. It will be the most explosive feast of joy, putting all the joy we've experienced in this life into pale light. And we will see him face to face. And truly we will say, my beloved is mine, and I am his.